They are. We're back on too. Okay, hi everybody, welcome. We are going to get started, and I think we'll have a couple other people join us a little bit. So welcome to the final session of today's Limmud, which is crazy. It just flew by. I guess this is what happens when you're having fun, right? So my name is Ben Greenberg, and I'll be moderating this session. We're so glad to have you with us for the next hour. We want to thank our presenting sponsor, Ancestry Pro Genealogists, for making eFestival possible, as well as our organizational partners, Hadar, the Jewish Book Council, JTS, and Pardes. Please just remember some following Zoom tips. We encourage you to press the speaker view button on the top of your window. If you'd like to ask a question of our presenter, you can write it in the chat window on the bottom right corner of your screen, or press raise the hand button and we'll call on you time permitting. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. So Ronit Treatman was born in Israel and grew up in Ethiopia and Venezuela. After serving in the Israeli Defense Forces Foreign Liaison Division, she studied International Business Administration in the United States. She was a stay-at-home mom of 3 children for 10 years residing in Philadelphia. And when her youngest child started school, she became a writer, editor, and ultimately the president of the Philadelphia Jewish Voice. During this period, she also created the blog and website, Hands on Jewish Holidays, and I can include that link in the chat in a little bit, and administered many social network communities focused on engagement with Judaism. She has lectured and presented at conferences around the United States on topics ranging from engagement with the descendants of Anusim, that's forced converts to Catholicism, to kosher locusts. And with that, we're really excited to learn from Ronit today. Ronit, please.
Hi, thank you so much, Ben, and welcome everyone. So as he mentioned, I lived in all those places. My father was an Israeli diplomat. When I was 1 year old, we moved to Ethiopia, and we didn't live in a city. We actually lived in the Rift Valley. My father's work was involved teaching Ethiopians how to improve their agricultural output. So it was still in the Israeli bubble in Ethiopia. And then the foreign ministry decided to send him to Venezuela. So up to this point, I had basically lived in my little Ethiopian bubble. And when we arrived in Venezuela, we were living in a small coastal city, and I was sent to a Catholic school. It was actually a Jesuit school, where I learned Spanish from nuns, who, by the way, were absolutely outstanding teachers. I have only respect for them. And I remember when I got there, when I understood a little bit of Spanish, I was learning one-on-one sessions with the nun who was in charge of the whole school. And I remember her explaining to me that God had brought us together for a special reason. We didn't yet know why that was, but this is why I was the only Israeli student they ever had. And I would be learning with them. And so not only did I learn Spanish, I learned some of their blessings in Latin, and I learned a little bit about Catholicism. And I lived in Venezuela for 12 years. And during those 12 years, there were 2 experiences that I'd like to share with you today, because I think they're relevant to the work I ended up doing later. So after a year in this city, we moved to the capital city of Caracas, and I was transferred to the international school, where half the school were children of other diplomats like my father, and the other half were Venezuelan kids who were there to learn really good English. One day in 1984, when I was a teenager, I was invited to another girl's home, and this was sort of Venezuelan family, very Catholic. When I went into the home, there was a crucifix on the wall, and it was very common there. And then her dad walked in, and it turned out he's introduced himself. We started chatting, and when he found out that I was from Israel, he got very excited, and he told me, well, I have to tell you that once upon a time, many years ago, we were Jews too. And I thought he was kidding. I just started laughing, because what was he talking about? You know, what were they doing being Jews? And then he said, no, really, we were Jews. And then he told me that a few years beforehand, he had visited Israel, not as a Catholic tourist, but to see who he could have been. And I was very fascinated by that idea, that he wanted to know who he could have been if they had not stopped being Jews. And this was a theme that was to resonate later in my life. And it was interesting because their last name was the name of a capital city, of a city, not the capital city, but of a city in Spain. And I was to find out later that many times that is an indication that a family was forced to convert during the Inquisition if they took on the name of the city where they lived. So this was one experience. The other experience was there was a man in the community in Caracas. The Jewish community of Caracas was evenly divided. Half of it was Ashkenazic, the other half was Sephardic, and each community has its own chief rabbi. So there was another Venezuelan man who the same thing had discovered he descended from Jews. He actually wanted to return to Judaism. This was in the 1980s. And he approached first the chief Sephardic rabbi and then the chief Ashkenazic rabbi. And they both said the same thing. Your family left Judaism and we don't want you back. You can't return. And this was a surprising response to me. I thought, well, we're taught to pursue justice. How can this be these two very wise, learned rabbis with so much respect? How can this be their decision? And it was after doing some research that I realized they were actually relying on a precedent that had been set. And you have to take it into context. It was set to protect the community from people coming in to proselytize. So it was a very, very hermetically sealed community. It really did not let many people in. And that was why that was a response he got. So then in 1986, I went back to Israel. I went and I served in the army, and I didn't really think much about these two experiences for a long time. Some interesting things that happened during the history of Spain. So 1492 was the Edict of Alhambra, where the Jews were expelled. And after that, it was not legal to reside in Spain if you were Jewish, upon pain of death. The Inquisition was abolished in Spain in, I believe it was 1896, if I'm not wrong. And then in 1968, Francisco Franco was the one who repealed the Alhambra decree. Until that point, it was not legal to reside in Spain if you were a Jew upon pain of death. In 1998, Pope John Paul II opened the archives of the Spanish, about the whole Inquisition, both Spanish and Portuguese, for researchers, people who wanted to explore what happened to their ancestors, to anybody who wanted to investigate. And in 2012, I believe it was, Prince Felipe of Spain. Basically in Spain, they said, any Sephardic who wants to return to get his Spanish citizenship can do it. So a lot of things occurred as time passed. Well, in 2012, it was also possible to suddenly regular people could get a DNA test if they were curious about their family history. And we had many questions. I mean, I descend from Holocaust survivors. We're always too scared to ask anything. So we just didn't. Then they passed away and we didn't have our answers, and things were burned during the war. There were no documents. We didn't know anything. We didn't know the names of people in the family. We really didn't know too much. So I was very curious. And so I figured, well, this was at least some information. What the DNA test can show, they can show what's called matrilineal and patrilineal paths. It can show where the family has been over the course of its history, kind of correlates geography with time. So there's this company in Canada called GeneBase. It was one of the first to offer this type of test to the public, and it's very, very serious, very scientific. So I was ready to do it. So I ordered these tests, and in order to get my matrilineal and patrilineal maps, they needed a brother and a sister. And fortunately for me, I do have a brother, so we both decided to go for it. We got our test. The test comes, you open it. There's a swab. You have to swab your cheek, pack it back, and mail it back. And then it takes at that time, it took a few months to do it. And then we got an email. Our results had arrived. So we opened my brother's results, which showed my father's side of the family. And that was what we had been told. It showed the family leaving the Near East, going to the Persian Empire and ending up in Bukhara, which is on the Silk Road. It's in modern day Uzbekistan. And they were there, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000 years, whatever it was. They were there for a very, very, very long time, very insular community. On my mother's family, this is the Ashkenazi side of the family. That's where the big surprise came. I thought we had been the same, 1,000, 2,000 years in Poland, then came the Holocaust, and then they had ended up going to Israel. That wasn't the story. There was a whole forgotten chapter before that. It showed the family leaving from the Near East, going to Iberia, and had stayed in one place in Iberia for so long that I got the name of a city. It was the city of Girona, and I'd never heard of it before. So I researched it. Girona is just north of Barcelona. It's about an hour drive, and had a very famous Jewish community, very cultured Jewish community. I just didn't know anything about it. So up to that point, in solidarity with the Sephardic friends I've had in Caracas, who had basically explained to me, they told me they had this memory fresh still of their family being expelled from Spain. They knew the city they were from. They carried the culture with them. They had the music and the food and the language and the stories. I didn't have any of those things, nothing. It can be completely erased in our family. Well, they also told me that when they left Spain, the rabbis had made a cherem. They had said it was forbidden to visit Spain for 500 years until 1992. And out of solidarity with them, I said, well, not only will I not visit Spain or Portugal until 1992, I don't ever see a reason to go there. Why should I go there when there's the whole rest of the world? Well, now I had a good reason. I said, well, it is after 1992, and I'm curious. I really need to see what this place is. So we flew to Barcelona, and then we drove up to Girona. And well, first of all, Spain is a very beautiful country, especially that part of Spain where we were visiting. And as we approached, first there's the modern city. It surrounds the medieval city. The medieval city is surrounded by a river, and then you have to cross a bridge. And it is very beautiful. It's this white stone city, kind of reminds me of Jerusalem a little bit. And by the time we got there, the Jewish rediscovery of the city had already begun to occur. It started with an artist who, what happened was the city had the medieval city had fallen into disrepair. People moved out. They built a more modern city around it, and then there was a gentrification movement that returned to the medieval city in order to rehabilitate it. So there was one artist, and they had completely forgotten their Jewish history, by the way. There was what happened was when the Jews left, their Christian neighbors were afraid to move into their homes. They were scared of the Inquisition. They didn't want to have anything to do with the Jewish property. They didn't want to be associated with Jews. So basically what happened, the Jewish homes stood vacant. The Christian homes, their neighbors sort of slowly encroached upon them, but they built over them. They didn't take over the house. They just built on top of it. So they were buried. This medieval level was buried under newer homes. And so one artist bought a property, and he was doing his rehabilitation work, and they broke downwards, and then they found the home underneath. And they were exploring what it was. It turned out to be a synagogue with a mikveh, and there was there were all these other indications there. If you look into the medieval level, you would see these doorways, and they had the way they would put the mezuzah in the door, they would actually carve out a spot for it. So there was a hewn spot in the doorway. And there wasn't just one, these were very small homes. So then you would find a few of them. And so some people recycled stones from the medieval times. Sometimes you would find a well, and it had a bunch of mezuzah sections in it because they were using those pieces of stone. So he was the first. Up to that point, it was sort of taboo to even admit there was any Jewish past, to the point where even before that, in the 1800s, there was a railroad built from France to Spain, and it cut through something that to this day is called Montjuic, which is the mountain of the Jews, where the Jewish cemetery is. They pulled up these old gravestones with Hebrew writing, but the only ones who paid any attention were a few archaeologists. Nobody really wanted to explore it too deeply. Well, this happened, this rehabilitation was happening during a time when they had a really special mayor who was a historian, and he was excited about the possibility of unearthing this Jewish city from the medieval city, and of inviting Jewish tourists to explore it. So he said, no, we need to preserve this history and uncover as much as we can. The way they did it was very interesting. They went into their archive to track the property sales. They had lost the map of what was the Jewish neighborhood, which there it was called the Jewish Kal. Kal comes from the Hebrew word kahal, community. So they were actually using those property deeds, were able to map it. So we got to explore it a little bit to see what it was like. And then this was very interesting for me because I am fluent in Spanish, having lived in Venezuela. I slipped into Girona. It felt very, very natural to me. There must be something in the way my family behaves that has retained the way it was in Girona, even over all this time, because I felt very, very comfortable with the people. And then we went to the bookstore, and I was speaking to the gentleman. There's a Jewish bookstore there, and the way they communicated with me was I had to really read between the words, because he was telling me, well, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Israel. He said, oh, I wonder about myself. My last name is Chicoira. Chicoira means chicory. They say that if you have the name of a plant, maybe you were Jewish once. That's the way he stated it. He knew what he was, but he didn't want to say it directly. And then he was telling me a little bit about tourism. He said, well, we get many young people. They're curious. They have customs in their families. They don't know what those things mean. They wonder if it could be a Jewish thing. They ask me. And he told me a little bit about some activities they do for tourism. He said one of the things they do, for example, when it's Hanukkah, they invite the public to build their own Chanukiah from clay, their own Chanukiah for Hanukkah. So all of this, I took note of it, and I went back. And then I wrote an article about my experience, and then I published it in the Times of Israel, and it went around the world. And that was that. All of a sudden, I started getting people connecting with me through Facebook, people in Barcelona, people from all over Spain, trying to talk to me. And they were telling me about my article and how they grew up in families where Judaism had been practiced secretly during the whole time of the Inquisition for 500 years. And I mean, when my first friend who connected with me told me this, I really just literally started to shake, because my Sephardic friends had told me, after 1492, the Jews either left Spain or converted to Catholicism or died. Those were the three choices. There was nothing Jewish left in Spain. And I realized this wasn't exactly the case. And these people had taken tremendous risks to keep the flame of Judaism alive in their families. And now that they felt they still were afraid. I mean, this is 2012, they were still afraid, but they wanted to ask about it, to discover more. And I just was very, very touched, and I decided to help them as much as I could. And so I started to communicate with them and with others in Facebook. And then I became friends with a very special man. His name is Ashley Perry. Ashley Perry comes from a Sephardic family from Cordoba. Officially, their last name is Perez, like Shimon Perez or other kind. Shimon Perez, he shortened it. He's not Sephardic, but Perez, there are other Perez in Spain. His last name is really Perez, and his family left Cordoba. They went first to Portugal, and then to Hamburg, and then to England. And then Ashley Perry made Aliyah. And when he did, he became the Director General of the Knesset Caucus for the reconnection with descendants of Spanish and Portuguese Jews, to help them reconnect with Israel, with Jews in any way they were interested in doing so. And he founded a nonprofit called Reconectar, which means reconnect. Same thing, to reconnect with Spanish and Portuguese Jews. And I've been volunteering with him since 2015 when he founded it. I manage the Facebook pages in Spanish and Portuguese. And basically what I call us is a safe space for people to ask questions. Any questions they have about their last names, traditions, marks on buildings. I've had all sorts of questions. I've been corresponding for these past 6 years. And then my correspondence with them inspired me to write a book, which really I dedicate to them, but it's for anybody who can find it useful. And I call it Hands-on Jewish Holidays, like my blog. And basically the way the book works is it explains each holiday. It's a brief synopsis, the history, because I think it's important to understand, what are we celebrating? Why are we celebrating this? And then I actually give practical ideas to people. How can you do this? Because not everyone has access to a rabbi. Not everybody has access to a community. Not everybody is welcomed in a Jewish community. And I want them to be able to explore it on their terms, in their own turf, their way. So I can show you a few ideas for Rosh Hashanah, which will be our next holiday, things that I've done with them. And so the first question people have asked me, I'm going to start with some of their questions, aren't all Jewish holidays inherently creative? And I say, well, I think they're as creative as the person who is organizing the holiday, because if you're giving somebody a little coloring book and saying, here, color this, I don't think that's really creative. So I think that the most important elements are, first of all, to keep alive our curiosity. Why are we doing this? What is it? Not just say just because we're doing it. That's not a good answer. And also I like it to be something that is that you experience it with all of your senses. So here, I will show you an example. So the first thing I'm going to share with you is to make the original candle that we light for both Shabbat and most holidays. And I don't know if anyone knows what the original candles were, but they were olive oil lamps. And so here's a piece of clay. I tell people we make an olive oil lamp, just like during the time of King David. We make a replica of something that was found in the digs in the city of David in Jerusalem. And then I tell people, one day you'll visit Israel. I really hope you do. When you do, you'll go to Jerusalem. You'll see the city of David. You will see the archaeological digs. And then if you visit the Israel Museum and you go to the archaeology department, you will see exactly this lamp displayed, used from that time. And I love this craft because we're using clay. Clay is a fabulous tactile material. I like it to be the color, just the natural clay color. This is the type that air dries. If people are in a hurry, they can bake it, but it's nice to let it air dry. The beautiful thing about clay is no matter what age, it is so much fun to play around with it. There's a Brazilian educator who loves using clay. His favorite students are children with Down syndrome. Why is that? He says, children with Down syndromes have the purest spirits, the most loving hearts, and clay is the way they express this spirit. So for this particular activity, I'm showing you how to make this oil lamp, but you can of course use clay to express yourself. So one thing you can do is you make a circle, you make a little bowl with it, this, and then you pinch one end. And this is called a pinch pot, an olive oil lamp. And I will show you what it looks like when it's ready. After you let it dry, this is what you get. This is exactly the kind of lamp they used during the time of King David. And here is a little piece of cotton wick. And of course, for a wick to be kosher, it has to be absorbent. It has to be able to not flicker after you light it. So cotton is very absorbent. The kinds of wicks in the Shulchan Aruch that are permitted are cotton, flax. We have, let's see, the family of cannabis is very kosher. Anything to help you have shalom bayit, peace in the home, is also a good plant. So, but this is cotton, and the way that it was lit, just take olive oil, normal cooking olive oil, you pour a little bit in and you light your candle. So this is one activity I've shared with them, and I love this activity. It ties us back to our history, to the land of Israel, to the kings, to King David, and it's a direct connection between them who have been in this hidden world to the past. The other thing that I love for Rosh Hashanah is to go out into nature, and I encourage everyone, I say, especially during this year of COVID, go outside. What else do we do in Rosh Hashanah? We eat honey, right? To have a sweet new year, we eat honey. And so we get into the question of what is honey in the Torah? It's a big discussion between scholars and archaeologists. So there are two kinds of honey that are mentioned in ancient Israel. One comes from bees. In the story of Samson, Samson finds a dead lion. Inside the lion is a beehive. Samson scrapes out the honey and he eats it. And it's very poetically described as the devourer becomes the nurturer. I love that line. That describes how Samson eats from the lion. So one thing I tell people to do is get out of the house, go to a garden. If possible, meet a beekeeper, go to an apiary. Beekeepers have wonderful educational programs. They teach about honey. They teach about bees. They teach about how honey is made. The other kind of candle I like to make for Rosh Hashanah is we use honeycomb, just a pure honeycomb. Like this one, you take the wax, the beeswax out, smell it. It's perfumed with honey, perfumed with the flowers whose nectar are used to make this. And so when you work with it, then your hands are also perfumed. It's a wonderful substance. All you do is you cut your wick, you line it up with your wax. Let me show you how I'm doing this. So then, this is very, very easy. All you do is you roll it. This. Little children love this. Children of every age. Adults too, everyone loves this. Just roll it like that. And then you have a lot of fun because you need to smush it tightly for it to work. So you really get it into your hands. You see how it doesn't lose its beautiful pattern. And you have a very lovely handcrafted candle that burns very, very cleanly and also connects you to bees for Rosh Hashanah. So this is so wonderful if you do this with your grandchildren, children, anyone else, when they have their own crafts at the holiday table, they love it. And then we get into the discussion again about honey, right? Because we celebrate with honey. So if you visit a beehive, I encourage everyone to have a variety of honeys to taste. If possible, get the whole comb, dip your spoon in the comb, do it inside, by the way. Don't do that outside because you're gonna get the bees attacking you. But if you can't, just get a variety of honey. I always encourage people to get one from Israel if possible, just to taste it. I supported my local apiary, which I think is a wonderful thing to do. If you can support your local apiary, your local beekeepers, you can learn from them. The other type of honey that is discussed in the Torah is fruit honey. And what kind of fruit did they make it from? I brought you 3 examples today. The 3 types of fruit used to make honey in ancient Israel. You have figs, you have dates, and you have raisins. So this is a date, it grows on a palm tree. And this is actually the way the fruit comes off of the tree. It ripens on the tree, and then it's just, what they do is they grow in bunches like grapes. So what people do is they put a net around them to protect them from birds. And then where they're completely plump and dry and wonderfully sweet, they have all the sugars inside them, they're picked exactly like this. And how is honey made from this? All you do is you boil this with some water, you simmer it, and it boils down to a syrup. And that was the ancient sweetener, the biblical fruit honey. You can make it with this. This is the figs. What they do is they grow on trees, and then they fall off and they dry in the sun just outside. And you get a fig that looks like this, and it's the same process. You cook it down with water, you turn it into a syrup. Raisins, the same. Sometimes people pick them and let them dry, but again, you can protect them with nets from birds, and they will dry on the vine as well. And when you have finished boiling it, this is what your honey looks like. It's a thick, beautifully colored syrup, very delicious. And you can dip apples in it, you can dip challah in it, you can make your biblical honey like this. So these are some of the activities I've encouraged people to do. I have had all kinds of interesting questions about traditions within traditions. It's called syncretism that they do. They don't know if they're celebrating a Jewish tradition or not. Some of them are, for example, celebrating Shabbat with the chamin. Chamin is chulent. So the real chamin is actually very, very ancient. It was a food cooked in ancient Israel. The way people would make it is they would dig a hole in the ground. They would burn wood in the hole until it turned into charcoal. And then they had a clay pot, which they would fill with, what the things you could get in ancient Israel would be maybe ducks or pigeons. Those were the sort of the birds that live there. Let's say there were no potatoes. That's a New World food. They would usually use wheat, whole wheat berries, water. They could spice it with garlic, chives, garlic that did grow there, and a little bit of maybe if they could find sea salt, or they wouldn't use it. They would, but this is how they would cook in ancient Israel, and then they would bury it because charcoal can stay hot underground for probably 3 days. I think they would just bury it overnight and cook it. And so if you take that, it would travel. It got to Iberia. They still made it. It was still called chamin. When the Inquisition came, they kept a lot of their foods. How do we know this? Because when the Inquisition records were open, there were the reasons for which people were called to testify in a court, or which you were on trial for, is because maybe your servant or your neighbor, somebody said, this person is eating this, they're celebrating some Jewish holiday. And sometimes that would be one of the things. They don't want to cook on a Saturday. They're eating cold food. They're eating Jewish foods, things that were considered Jewish foods. Well, first, of course, there would be something like matzah. If you were eating something that looked like matzah, you would be called in. Let's see, eggplant. Eggplant was considered very Jewish food. Cilantro. Cilantro, the priest would even tell people there is no cilantro in Spanish food to this day. The priest would stand in the church and they would say, if you're cut using cilantro, you're going right to the bonfire. And that was something that was actually used medicinally by both Jews and Muslims in Spain of the time. It disappeared. It disappeared. It's still a taboo. And it's modern Spanish chefs who are saying, we're going to reclaim our herbs. We're going to stop being so afraid of it all. So I did want to leave time. I don't know if I need to leave to stop, if you want me to keep going. I did want to leave time if anybody has any questions for me about anything. All right, I'm happy to keep going too. Okay, so let's talk about some of the questions I've had that have come up. We've had people really are very interested in their last names. I'm very curious. I don't know what last name we would have had. Last names are a fairly recent addition to Jewish people, so it's hard to track back, to go through time. But the last names questions is very interesting. There is a list of names that was published. Some people maybe are Jewish, maybe aren't. There are plenty of non-Jewish people who have those names. So you have to hire genealogists to find out. I'd be very curious what kind of names we had, but since it's a matrilineal line, I don't know. There is now a company in Israel that can do it with DNA testing. There's a DNA test that will match the people who are alive today with distant DNA relatives. So I have a friend from Portugal. She returned to Judaism, and this company found relatives in Israel, the ones who didn't convert. That actually happened in my family. I think I forgot to say this, that in my family, I found Girona, and then when I looked at my map, what it showed was the family is there until 1492, and then it splits in half. The half I descend from went to Italy, the Netherlands, and then Poland. But the other half stayed, and I was doing some research about why they would do that. And it was fairly common. Sometimes part of the family stayed because people were old, they were sick, they couldn't leave. It was a very difficult journey at the time. They just couldn't do it. Sometimes they stay there because they wanted to sell property, businesses. They had financial constraints upon them. So what happened with my family is that half stayed. I'm sure they were forced to convert to Catholicism. And then there was this period, a very short period of 60 years, when the children of the Spanish and Portuguese monarchs married each other. The whole thing was one kingdom. And it was during this time that they were permitted to go to any part of any of the colonies of either Spain or Portugal. And the map showed my family going to America. They went to Recife in Brazil. This was probably around 1580, something like that. And then they just stay there. And I don't know what that means. I don't know if I still have very, very distant relatives today in northern Brazil, or if later during the upheavals and wars and diseases, maybe they all died. I don't really know which one it was. I'm very, very interested to find out. Maybe I'll be able to find out like my friend did by going with this DNA company. I don't know. But I asked myself who they ended up being, because what I did with my book, so I wrote a book with these kinds of activities that are basically for every Jewish holiday. And then I translated it to Spanish. And then I hired a friend of mine to translate it to Portuguese. And this friend of mine is very special to me. Her ancestor was actually burned at the stake in Portugal for what is called Judaizing, for practicing Judaism, for teaching Judaism, for opening the first synagogue in Brazil and the first Jewish school. And her name was Branca Diaz. And she was actually taken back to Portugal and tried and burned at the stake. So I hired her great descendant, a young woman named Lucia, who translated to Portuguese. And I told Lucia, I said, you've come full circle. I mean, your ancestor died for doing what you're doing. And so it was very emotional for both of us. So I self-published it to make it affordable. I wanted my my readers in Spain and Portugal and Brazil and everywhere in Latin America to be able to access the book as inexpensively as possible. So I really wrote it as a mitzvah. So it's also available in English. And once I realized some similarities, I actually hired another friend to translate it to Russian, because I feel that the Jews who came out of the former Soviet Union in a way had a similar experience, in that they were not allowed to practice Judaism, were not allowed to learn about it. And many of them who came out, and I met some of them when I was a soldier in Israel. That was the first sort of big wave of Russian immigrants. They had a thirst to know and didn't know, and didn't have a wonderful array of materials to read. And so I'm sure that between then and now things have been written, but I figured, why not? I already have it, so I'll translate it. That was actually one of the interesting things about the Spanish Jewish community, the Spanish-speaking Jewish community. There is almost nothing published in Spanish like my book, and I was very surprised to discover that. I have the friend who pointed that out to me was the first descendant of forced converts who returned to Judaism and became a rabbi in Barcelona. His mikveh was the ocean. He returned to Judaism, he became a rabbi, and he studied in the United States. And he was the one who told me it was unbelievable. There's so much in English, and in Spanish, it's a desert. There's absolutely nothing. And I checked what he said, and he was right. I couldn't believe it. He was absolutely right. There was nothing in Spanish. And I said, well, I'm determined to help them, and I will do this. And this was truly one of the most masochistic things I've ever done to myself. I will never be dismissive of anyone who writes anything, no matter how unappealing I may personally find it, because if someone really puts forth the effort, they're pouring their soul into that book, and it is really excruciatingly difficult to do. So, I will not be a harsh critic of anyone's work. So I hope somebody has a question for me. I would love to have a question to answer, so that we can take the conversation wherever my audience wants it to go.
I'll actually start us off with a question, because one thing, so first of all, I really enjoyed getting to hear your talk. I'm curious to hear, you talked about some of the foods that sometimes were associated with Judaism, and you talked, matzah makes sense to me, or something that looks like matzah, but the eggplant and the cilantro was so interesting to me, because I don't necessarily think of those as exclusively Jewish foods. I'm just curious, can you talk a little bit more about
Sure. I will talk about it. So first of all, I will say the best thing that ever happened to Iberia, in my opinion, was the Muslim conquest. It was the best thing that ever happened to them culinarily, because what did the Muslims bring? They brought olive oil, they brought olives, they brought almonds and eggplants, and they brought spices. They really made the food so much better than it had been before under the Germanic Visigoths. The food was much, much better. The Muslims were foodies. They came up from North Africa. They formed the caliphate. So, for example, Ashley Perry's family lived in the caliphate of Cordoba, and it was just better in every way. First of all, under the Muslim caliphate, the Jews and Christians and Muslims lived in what was called the convivencia, what would you call it in English? I don't know if it was called the convivience, but they lived together peacefully with each other. And the Caliph, whose name was Abd al-Rahman, he was determined to make Cordoba this brilliant jewel of a city, a center of learning. He invited scholars from all over the world to exchange ideas and to record them in books. He hired translators. He had Jewish translators. He had Christian translators. He had Muslims all working together, taking the works of antiquities from the Greeks and the Romans, translating them to Arabic. He actually inspired what was known as the Great Sephardic Education, where the Sephardics who flourished under Abd al-Rahman wanted to imitate him, to also have a great center of Jewish learning, to actually record things, not just Torah, but also philosophy and poetry and medicine. You had all kinds of experts coming in and sharing ideas. So it was that was when the Jews first began to think of themselves as Sephardic, of Iberia, Sfarad. That happened in the 10th century under Abd al-Rahman. And culinarily, they were also influenced by the Moors, who brought all these foods in, but they were also associated with them and with the Jews. The Jews had so many ways of making eggplant, incredible variety of ways, not just the ways that you would think of like with tomato sauce or something like that. No, they had sweet eggplant, the whole technique of dipping something in water and sugar and caramelize it. That came of preservation that was brought by the Muslims. So the way of preserving fruits like that was something they had invented. And the Jews did it as well. And they would do it even with eggplant. But eating garbanzos, eating eggplants, that would get you an immediate appointment with Inquisitor. If you were eating romaine lettuce, I mean, things that sound like a delicious salad to us, that was looking for problems. Things that would give you away. If you were trying to celebrate Shabbat, it wasn't just the food. If you were under the Inquisition, if you were seen wearing clean clothes, cleaning your house on a Friday, those were not good things to be doing. Bathing, the Jews and Muslims of Cordoba were very, very clean. The Muslims were known for their bathhouses. Jews had the mikvahs. They bathed a lot more than the Christians. And during the Inquisition, bathing, being clean, that was not a good thing. It was a sign that you were secretly practicing something you weren't supposed to be practicing. Wearing clean clothes, you were not working, not cooking, having your friends over on a Saturday to eat and talk. You were asking for trouble. So also not eating pork. So I have a friend who published a cookbook written by, she had all these recipes from her great grandmothers. Her name is Jenny Milgram. The cookbook, she's from Cuba, a Cuban Jew. She's a Cuban who returned to Judaism, who discovered she was Jewish. And she had the recipes. One of the recipes they have is amazing. It is a recipe of something that looks like pork chops. It is not pork chops. It's more like a French toast that was cut to look like pork chops. So when it sat on the plate, it looked like you were eating pork, but you weren't. And in Portugal, there's a kind of sausage, very smart. They made it, I believe they used goat meat, maybe sheep's meat, but the point was they spiced it in a way that it looked and maybe even tasted like pork, but it's not pork. And so that was another trick that was used that, again, that is now associated with Jews. So yes, there were some foods, even here in the United States, in Philadelphia, Thomas Jefferson, it lasted so long that Thomas Jefferson called fish fried in olive oil Jewish fish. Jews like Ashley Perry's family brought that fish and chips to England. That was something that was actually a Jewish food, that it wasn't fried in lard or butter, it was in olive oil. So then they took the New World potatoes and included them, but that's a Jewish way of preparation. So yes, foods there's a very wonderful professor, Dr. David Gitlitz, who unfortunately passed away last year, but he was a brilliant man who did a lot of research from primary sources in the archives of the Inquisition. And he wrote the first cookbook. It's called A Drizzle of Honey. And he really explores all the different times during the testimony that they were talking about the food people were eating and how the food pointed to them being Jewish. Sometimes it was just not knowing Catholic traditions. Oh, you're serving milk now, but we don't have milk. It's this kind of a Friday, or this is a Friday when it's Lent. We don't eat this meat, or that kind of mistake. And initially, I will say that initially the Inquisitors were more lenient because people had to have a learning curve. They didn't know how to be Catholics yet. So sometimes they would get off more easily if they just didn't know. They were trying their best. They didn't know, but over time there was a less lenient sentence. The interesting traditions that my friends shared with me that would have gotten them into a lot of trouble, they had these special clay pots, and every Friday they would light, their mother, whoever was the woman of the family, would light candles, put it in the clay pot, close it with a lid, and then put it in a cabinet. And they still do that every Friday. They've been doing it since 1492. They light Shabbat candle. They don't know the blessing. They light candle. They have these crosses. Sometimes they draw them in the entrance and the exterior of the homes. You'll see this in northern Portugal. They are crypto-Jewish crosses to stand in for a mezuzah, even in Latin America, there's a very common thing where a son comes in, he comes to his father, or it's usually to the man. He'll come to the father or the uncle and he'll say, bendición, bless me, father, bless me, uncle. What is he getting? He's getting the Kohanim blessing, right? To the son. The same one that we do, many of us who have children will do when we do Shabbat dinner, we bless our children. Well, that's bendición. That's what it is. They just don't know they're doing that, but they are. Also, they have, this is something in both Spain, Portugal, and Latin America. There's something called syncretism. Syncretism means that you take a tradition from one religion, you hide it in another one. Now, in Latin America, everyone who wasn't a Christian was doing that. The Native Americans, the Africans who were brought as slaves, and the Jews were all doing syncretism. And to this day have it in their tradition. So the Jews had, and well, everyone would do this, they added an extra saint. The special saint the Jews added was Saint Esther. In Ladino, they call her Santa Esterica. So the Catholic Church doesn't really like that, but they have Saint Esther, and this is their, she represents two different things to Jews and to Catholics. Catholics, when they see Esther, they think of obedience, an obedient daughter who did what her uncle said. To the Jews, she's a symbol of, you know, of rebellion, a symbol of standing up to being pushed down, to being made into something she wasn't. She's known for hiding who she was until it was safe to come out. So the crypto Jews really identified with her. So they have Saint Esther. They still have them, and you can still get them even in New Mexico today. You can still find a Saint Esther. So if anyone else would like to ask me anything, I'm happy to. I mean, I was very, very fascinated. I learned something new every single day corresponding with people. It's very difficult for them, those who are trying to return. It's a very difficult process. I think the community still remains very close to them. And I understand that there was a long time where the community felt they had to defend themselves. But I mean, I feel that as long as someone is earnest and really learns and really wants to return the right way. I mean, even Maimonides encouraged allowing forced converts to return. And there are recorded ceremonies of return in North Africa, North African rabbis who, because that was one of the routes of escape, right? They would go to North Africa and then they were allowed to come back to the communities. And I feel even if it's been this long, if someone can show that they descended from a family like that, and they still feel like they wish to return, we should make it possible for them. If they can show direct matrilineal descent, which is very difficult to do, then they never stop being Jews. If they cannot show it, then I still think there should be a path of conversion for them to allow them to rejoin their people if it's something that they still want. Because I personally, I want them to return. I welcome them, and I feel a very special connection to them. When I see them, I know this could have been me. I know that this was half of my family. I know that many of us will be surprised to discover we may have relatives in Brazil or Portugal or Spain or Venezuela or Mexico or Peru. I mean, there are a lot of forced converts who were the first Europeans who lived there, who settled there.
I see that there's a question from Richard.
Since we're winding down, I thought that I would, even though what you just talked about is very important, and it was extraordinarily important to make the distinction between the traditions in Corona from Andalusia, absolutely important. But I want to end with perhaps, I'm curious if you want to confirm it or not, but when we were in Corona, we were told that during the early Inquisition time, the Jews would purposely do their housework with their doors open on Shabbat. And to this day, we're told that in Corona, doing housework is called Sabbato.
Yes.
And it's a wonderful, and of course they don't know why it's called Sabbato,
Yeah.
but it goes back to the very purposeful, visible attempt to somehow show we're doing housework on Saturdays, and it's kind of it shows it's kind of a linguistic syncretism, but it was we're ending. I thought that was a kind of amusing kind of thing, and frankly, I want to tell you something. Ever since we're there, when we do housework at our home. Sorry, I moved. What I said is when we do housework at our home, when we clean up, we say we're doing Sabbato.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned it. There are things in Spanish and Portuguese language that do go back to the caliphate. You have first, the most interesting one that they say in Spanish is actually from the Muslims. They say, ojalá, that means, oh, Allah. But they don't know they're saying that, but they are. Or, that the way that it was told to me was it was hacer el sábado, to do the Shabbat, to clean. There are other expressions. They'll go, oh, que masada, what a masada, right? what a fight we put up. What I think is very interesting is in Portuguese, there is an expression that is no less bitter than anything you'll hear out of my Yiddish speaking grandparents, which is they say, what are you doing? Getting boats? And you know why they have this expression? Because what happened when the Jews tried to leave Portugal? The king didn't want the Jews to leave. He didn't have anything against Jews. He only agreed to have an inquisition and a forced conversion to have that marriage go through of his son to the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand. He wanted to keep his Jews. He knew they were good for his kingdom. They added a lot of wealth. He needed them. What did he do? He didn't let anybody leave. He brought the priests to the port. They sprinkled a little water. They said, you're all Jews. I mean, you're all Christians now. You're staying. So he didn't let the boats that they had paid for come and get them. So they have a very cynical expression to this day where they say, what are you doing? Getting boats? It's a fool's errand. This will not happen. There's a whole list of many other kinds of expressions that do come from Jews that they still use today, and they don't know why they're using them. So it's a very good point. And yeah, I think that the other interesting thing that is how our family does it that I hadn't thought about. So when I sweep my house, right? And this is how my grandparents taught me to sweep. This is how I clean. I sweep everything to the center of the room. Then I get my dustpan and I collect it and I throw it away. I never sweep anything out the door. No one in my family does. Well, crypto-Jewish families do that too. There was somebody who did this study that other families in Spain and Portugal would sweep all the debris out of the door, but never, I don't know what it is, but never families of descended from Jews. I don't really know why. There are all kinds of purification rituals around death that they still do. There's a whole thing where if you were from a crypto-Jewish family, you didn't want to go to a church and you never called the priest when somebody died, in case, especially for the ones who knew what they were, so they wouldn't confess at the last moment. They wouldn't let the priest before the person died. And there are some Catholics that will put sheets up over mirrors. They'll cover mirrors the way we do. They have things with water and being clean. There are many families that don't eat pork. There are families in Mexico, they do not eat pork. There are regions of Mexico where they just don't eat that. They have goat, they have other things, they don't eat pork there. There are families in Spain where they say it's not healthy, you can't eat it. So they think it's a health thing, or it's not clean. They have things about purity and cleanliness. They don't know where it comes from. And by the way, one of the most interesting things that the Christians took from the Jews, they had a whole thing about distinguishing between new Christians and old Christians, the Christian families that were always Christians and the ones who became Christians because of the Inquisition. And they actually took that from the Jews, because what did Jews do? They said, oh, you're not Jewish, we won't marry you. So what did they do? They said, we need to have purity of blood. You have to have pure Catholic blood to be pure enough. And even though some Jews even willingly converted to Catholicism, they were not considered pure old Christian blood. And if you go to some places, this was, they kept that, they knew who these families were. They had a banner hung up in the church with all the names. There was one museum, one Catholic museum that still displays it, that shows you the names of the families. And they were well known in the Balearic Islands. These families are called Xuetes, which is a very derogatory name. It's like the way I tell people, please call them Anusim or Bnei Anusim, the children of forced converts. Don't call them all those other names. All of them win swine. They're all derogatory. And I don't let people use them, but there is a list of families like that. That, by the way, is in Palma de Mallorca, which the chief rabbi of Israel recognized that community as having never stopped being Jewish, having only married each other, and they're Jews, and they've come back. So that was another thing they took from the Jews. They have all these traditions they don't even realize. And well, what was interesting, it was still such a taboo to talk about it. So here it is in the 1980s, when I finished high school, I wrote the article. I also wrote an article in Spanish about this part that I told you about, where my family split into two and half converted to Catholicism. I published it in Spanish and I shared it. And all of a sudden, people I was friends with for 35 years, classmates, teachers, started to write to me saying, oh yeah, in my family, we're told our family is, was from a Jewish family. Can you check? I was like, wow. I have a very close friend. I always send something from her father. They're from Peru, but I couldn't understand it. It just didn't make any sense. I mean, they're Peruvian. Now I finally get it. She said, yes, we were Jews once, and he told me and I knew it. And here's the name. And her husband too, both of them. Her husband's from Colombia. There was just a genetic study that confirms it, that was published this year in National Geographic, that showed that a much higher percentage than I was expecting of people in certain cities in Colombia, in Brazil, and in Mexico had Sephardic Jewish genes. These had always been stories passed down in the families. One of the young men from Colombia became a geneticist and checked. He checked his community in Cartagena, he checked a community in Peru, and one in Mexico. And I think it was maybe 10% Jewish genes. It was much, much more than I was expecting to still see there. So it actually was true. And, the other Spaniards, I know that they do call the people of Catalonia les Jews, they call them the Jews, and always have, because more of them sort of were families like mine that stayed there and converted, but still had a lot of just whatever it is that we do that makes us different. They still had it. I mean, whatever it is, I still kept it because I felt so comfortable with them.
I apologize. I have to get off. It's a little bit late. And I apologize. Thank you so much. Then I apologize.
Thank you for attending.
So I think we're gonna wrap up a little bit, but Ronit, this was really interesting. I really enjoyed it. I actually just posted now the link to your book on Amazon. So if people are interested, I highly encourage you to check it out. I also posted the link to your blog as well. So I hope people will check it out. I found this very informative and really interesting. I want to thank everybody for attending this session. I want to thank Ronit for providing us such an interesting opportunity to learn both about a little bit about your story and how it relates to like the broader Jewish story, as well as like the cool crafting opportunities. I have a 3-year-old, so I'll certainly partake of some of those.
Yes, and I tell people, share your pictures with me, please. I love getting 3-year-olds covered in clay, dirty, clay mark on the wall, driving you crazy. Love it. This is the time to do it, because later you'll be old and clean like me. But when your kid is young, that's when you have to wallow in it and have a great time. It won't come back. So enjoy every second, I'm telling you.
Amazing.
You won't be sorry later. Enjoy yourself now.
Amen to that. Well, thank you everybody for attending the session, for attending eFestival as well. And we really appreciate you joining us, and we wish you a wonderful rest of your Sunday. And thank you again, Ronit, for a really informative, interesting session.
Thank you so much for including me. I really, really appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.